Believe it or not, this next piece comes from the American Conservative, Revolt of the Rich. It's from August 27th, 2012, by Mike Lofgren. Illustration by Miguel Davila. It was 1993, during congressional debate over the North American Free Trade Agreement. I was having lunch with a staffer for one of the rare Republican congressmen who opposed the policy of so-called free trade. To this day, I remember something my colleague said. The rich elites of this country have far more in common with their counterparts in London, Paris, and Tokyo than with their fellow American citizens. That was only the beginning of the period when the realities of outsourced manufacturing, financialization of the economy, and growing income disparity started to seep into the public consciousness, so at the time it seemed like a striking and novel statement. At the end of the Cold War, many writers predicted the decline of the traditional nation-state. Some looked at the demise of the Soviet Union and foresaw the territorial state breaking up into statelets of different ethnic, religious, or economic compositions. This happened in the Balkans, the former Czechoslovakia, and Sudan. Others predicted a weakening of the state due to the rise of fourth-generation warfare and the inability of national armies to adapt to it. The quagmires of Iraq and Afghanistan lend credence to that theory. There have been numerous books about globalization and how it would eliminate borders, but I am unaware of a well-developed theory from that time about how the super-rich and the corporations they run would secede from the nation-state. I do not mean secession by physical withdrawal from the territory of the state, although that happens from time to time. For example, Eric Prince, who was born into a fortune, is related to the even bigger Amway fortune and made yet another fortune as CEO of the mercenary for hire firm Blackwater, moved his company, renamed XE, to the United Arab Emirates in 2011. What I mean by secession is a withdrawal into enclaves, an internal immigration whereby the rich disconnect themselves from the civic life of the nation and from any concern about its well-being except as a place to extract loot. Our plutocracy now lives like the British in colonial India, in the place and ruling it, but not of it. If one can afford private security, public safety is of no concern. If one owns a Gulfstream jet, crumbling bridges cause less apprehension, and viable public transportation doesn't even show up on the radar screen. With private doctors on call and a chartered plane to get to the Mayo Clinic, why worry about Medicare? Being in the country but not of it is what gives the contemporary American super rich their quality of being abstracted and clueless. Perhaps that explains why Mitt Romney's regular guy anecdotes always seem a bit strained. What do we think about Joe Biden's regular guy anecdotes? Or even Hillary Clinton's or Elizabeth Warren's regular girl anecdotes? We actual regular people know that it's not real. We can always tell. I discussed this with a radio host who recounted a story about Robert Rubin, former Secretary of the Treasury, as well as an executive at Goldman Sachs and Citigroup. Rubin was being chauffeured through Manhattan to reach some event whose attendees consisted of the great and the good, such as himself. Along the way, he encountered a traffic jam, and on arriving to his event late, he complained to a city functionary with the power to look into it. "Where was the jam?" asked the functionary. Rubin, who had lived most of his life in Manhattan, a place of east-west numbered streets and north-south avenues, couldn't tell him. The super rich who determine our political arrangements apparently inhabit another, more refined dimension. To some degree, the rich have always secluded themselves from the gaze of the common herd. Their habit for centuries has been to send their offspring to private schools. But now this habit is exacerbated by the plutocracy's palpable animosity towards public education and public educators, as Michael Bloomberg has demonstrated. To the extent public education reform is popular among billionaires and their tax-exempt foundations, one suspects it is as a lever to divert the more than $500 billion in annual federal, state, and local education funding into private hands, meaning themselves and their friends. What Halliburton did for U.S. Army logistics, school privatizers will do for public education. A century ago, at least, we got some attractive public libraries out of Andrew Carnegie. Noblesse oblige, like Carnegie's, is presently lacking among our seceding plutocracy. In previous episodes of this show, we've talked about noblesse oblige. Traditional conservatives believe that the plutocrats ought to take better care of their peasants, and that's noblesse oblige. When the new right came into power, Maggie Thatcher, Ronnie Reagan, and their ilk, meritocratic thinking pushed out all ideas of noblesse oblige. I'm not saying I like the condescending tone of noblesse oblige, but it's a lot better than our current oligarchs are doing. In both world wars, even a Harvard man or a New York socialite might know the weight of an army pack. Now the military is for suckers from the laboring classes whose subprime mortgages you just sliced into CDOs and sold to gullible investors in order to buy your second Bentley or rustle up the cash to get Rod Stewart to perform at your birthday party. The sentiment among the super rich towards the rest of America is often one of contempt rather than noblesse. Back in February of 2007, on the eve of the financial crisis, Blackstone co-founder Steven Schwarzman celebrated his 60th birthday with a party so extravagant and so outrageous that when the economy crashed some 7 months later, its memory would retroactively turn him into one of Wall Street's greatest cartoon villains. Held at the 7th Regiment Armory on Park Avenue, part of which was transformed into a large-scale replica of the Schwarzman's Manhattan apartment, the party featured Martin Short as the master of ceremonies, performances by Rod Stewart and Patti LaBelle, a dinner of lobster, filet mignon, and baked Alaska, along with an array of expensive wines, replicas of Schwarzman's art collection on the walls, as well as a full-length portrait of him by Andrew Festing, the president of the Royal Society of Portrait Painters, and around 350 guests, including Barbara Walters, Maria Bartimaeiro, Tina Brown, and Melania and Donald Trump. Of course he can do whatever the fuck he wants with his money. Come on. So what is a CDO? A collateralized debt obligation, CDO, is a complex structured finance product that is backed by a pool of loans and other assets and sold to institutional investors. A CDO is a particular type of derivative because, as its name implies, its value is derived from another underlying asset. These assets become the collateral if the loan defaults. To create a CDO, investment banks gather cash flow generating assets such as mortgages, bonds, and other types of debt and repackage them into discrete classes or tranches based on the level of credit risk assumed by the investor. These tranches of securities become the final investment products, bonds, whose names can reflect their specific underlying assets. For example, mortgage-backed securities are comprised of mortgage loans and asset-backed securities. ABS contain corporate debt, auto loans, or credit card debt. CDOs are called collateralized because the promised repayments of the underlying assets are the collateral that gives the CDOs their value. Other types of CDOs include collateralized bond obligations, CBOs, investment-grade bonds that are backed by a pool of high-yield but lower-rated bonds, and collateralized loan obligations, CLOs, single securities that are backed by a pool of debt that often contain corporate loans with a low credit rating. In other words, a lot of the same bullshit that got us into the 2008 financial crisis. The earliest CDOs were constructed in 1987 by the former investment bank Drexel Burnham Lambert, where Michael Milken, then called the junk bond king, reigned. The Drexel bankers created these early CDOs by assembling portfolios of junk bonds issued by different companies. Ultimately, other securities firms launched CDOs containing other assets that had more predictable income streams, such as automobile loans, student loans, credit card receivables, and aircraft leases. However, CDOs remained a niche product until 2003-2004, when the U.S. housing boom led CDO issuers to turn their attention to subprime mortgage-backed securities as a new source of collateral for CDOs. Collateralized debt obligations exploded in popularity, with CDO sales rising almost tenfold from $30 billion in 2003 to $225 billion in 2006. But their subsequent implosion, triggered by the US housing correction, saw CDOs become one of the worst performing instruments in the subprime meltdown, which began in 2007 and peaked in 2009. The bursting of the CDO bubble inflicted losses running into hundreds of billions of dollars for some of the largest financial services institutions. These losses resulted in the investment banks either going bankrupt or being bailed out via government intervention, and helped to escalate the global financial crisis, the Great Recession, during this period. Stephen Schwarzman, the hedge fund billionaire CEO of the Blackstone Group, who hired Rod Stewart for his $5 million birthday party, believes it is the rabble who are socially irresponsible. Speaking about low-income citizens who pay no income tax, he says, "You have to have skin in the game. I'm not saying how much people should do, but we should all be part of the system. For real." But millions of Americans who do not pay federal income taxes do pay federal payroll taxes. These taxes are regressive, and the dirty little secret is that over the last several decades, they have made up a greater and greater share of federal revenues. In 1950, payroll and other federal retirement contributions constituted 10.9% of all federal revenues. By 2007, the last normal economic year before federal revenues began falling, they made up 33.9%. Let me harbor a guess right here about 2007 being the last normal economic year. I think that's when they stopped pretending altogether that taxes were raising money for anything that they were selling us. I would appreciate it if anyone who knows this would comment in the comment section below this video. By contrast, corporate income taxes were 26.4% of federal revenues in 1950. By 2007, they had fallen to 14.4%. So who has skin in the game? While there is plenty to criticize the incumbent president for, namely Barack Obama, notably his broadening and deepening of President George W. Bush's extra-constitutional surveillance state, under President Obama, the overall federal tax burden has not been raised, it has been lowered. Approximately half the deficit impact of the stimulus bill was the result of tax cut provisions. The temporary payroll tax cut and other miscellaneous tax cut provisions make up the rest of the cuts we have seen in the last 3.5 years. Yet, for the president's heresy of advocating that billionaires who receive the bulk of their income from capital gains should pay taxes at the same rate as the rest of us, Schwarzman said this about Obama: "It's a war. It's like when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. For a hedge fund billionaire to defend his extraordinary tax privileges vis-a-vis the rest of the citizenry in such a manner shows an extraordinary capacity to be an asshole. He lives in a world apart, psychologically as well as in the flesh." Schwarzman benefits from the so-called carried interest rule loophole. Financial sharks typically take their compensation in the form of capital gains rather than salaries, thus knocking down their income tax rate from 35% to 15%. But that's not the only way Mr. Skin in the Game benefits. The 6.2% Social Security tax and the 1.45% Medicare tax apply only to wages and salaries, not to capital gains distributions. Accordingly, Schwarzman is stiffing the system in two ways. Not only is his income tax rate less than half the top marginal rate, he is shorting the Social Security system that others of his billionaire colleagues like Pete Peterson say is unsustainable and needs to be cut. This lack of skin in the game may explain why Romney has been so coy about releasing his income tax returns. It would make sense for someone with $264 million in net worth to joke that he is unemployed, as if he were some jobless sheet metal worker in Youngstown. If he were really saying in code that his income stream is not a salary subject to payroll deduction. His effective rate for federal taxes at 14% is lower than that of many a wage slave. And Romney is not the only one who is coy about releasing his income tax returns. And capital gains is why. After the biggest financial meltdown in 80 years and a consequent long, steep drop in the American standard of living, Who is the nominee for one of the only two parties allowed to be competitive in American politics? None other than Mitt Romney, the man who says corporations are people. Opposing him will be the incumbent president, who will raise up to $1 billion to compete. Much of that loot will come from the same corporations, hedge fund managers, merger and acquisition specialists, and leveraged buyout artists the president will denounce in pro forma fashion. Can you say hypocrite? The super rich have seceded from America even as their grip on its control mechanisms has tightened. But how did this evolve historically? What does it mean for the rest of us? And where is it likely to be going? That wealth worship and a consequent special status for the wealthy as a kind of clerisy should have arisen in the United States is hardly surprising, given the peculiar sort of Protestantism that was planted here from the British Isles. Starting with the Puritanism of New England, there has been a long and intimate connection between the sanctification of wealth and America's economic and social relationships. The rich are a class apart because they are the elect. How's that for all my churchy friends? The rich are the elect. That's why my sisters can vote for Donald J. Trump. Most present-day Americans, if they think about the historical roots of our wealth worship at all, will say something about free markets, rugged individualism, and the Horatio Alger myth, all in a purely secular context. Horatio Alger Jr., January 13, 1832 to July 18, 1899, was an American writer of young adult novels about impoverished boys and their rise from humble backgrounds to lives of middle-class security and comfort through hard work, determination, courage, and honesty. His writings were characterized by the rags to riches narrative, which had a formative effect on the United States during the Gilded Age. All of Alger's juvenile novels share essentially the same theme, known as the Horatio Alger myth. A teenage boy works hard to escape poverty. Often it is not hard work that rescues the boy from his fate, but rather some extraordinary act of bravery or honesty. The boy might return a large sum of lost money or rescue someone from an overturned carriage. This brings the boy and his plight to the attention of a wealthy individual. So all we have to do is suck up to wealthy individuals and we're good to go. But perhaps the most notable 19th century exponent of wealth as virtue and poverty as the mark of Cain was Russell Herman Conwell, a canny Baptist minister, founder of perhaps the first tabernacle large enough that it could later be called a megachurch, and author of the immensely famous Acres of Diamonds speech of 1890 that would make him a rich man. This is what he said: "I say that you ought to get rich, and it is your duty to get rich. The men who get rich may be the most honest men you find in the community. Let me say here clearly, 98 out of 100 of the rich men of America are honest. That is why they are rich. That is why they are trusted with money. I sympathize with the poor, but the number of poor who are to be sympathized with is very small. To sympathize with a man whom God has punished for his sin is to do wrong. Let us remember, there is not a poor person in the United States who is not made poor by his own shortcomings." You fucking piece of shit. I never bumped into him before. Wow. Evidently, Conwell was made of sterner stuff than the sob sister moralizing in the Sermon on the Mount. Should go back sometime and read that, sisters. Chapter 6 of the book of Matthew, I remember. I really have to say that the way you all think about riches is not the way that Jesus describes it in that chapter. Read chapters 5 and 7 again too if you get a chance. Somewhat discordantly though, Conwell had been drummed out of the military during the Civil War for deserting his post. What a guy! For Conwell, as for the modern tax-avoiding expat billionaire, the dollar sign tends to trump Old Glory. Yeah, that pattern has not gotten any better. The conjoining of wealth, Christian morality, and the American way of life reached an apotheosis in Bruce Barton's 1925 book, The Man Nobody Knows. The son of a Congregationalist minister, Barton, who was an advertising executive, depicted Jesus as a successful salesman, publicist, and the very role model of the modern businessman. "Behold, I am Republican Jesus. Screw the poor, sick, and the meek. Give it all to the 1%. But this peculiarly American creed took a severe hit after the crash of 1929, and wealth ceased to be equated with godliness. I wonder why. While the number of Wall Street suicides has been exaggerated in national memory, Jesse Livermore, perhaps the most famous of the Wall Street speculators, shot himself, and so did several others of his profession, meaning they had no profession other than that of being a parasite. There was then still a lingering old-fashioned sense of shame now generally absent from the uber-rich. While many of the elites hated Franklin Roosevelt, consider the famous New Yorker cartoon wherein the rich socialite tells her companions, "Come along, we're going to the Translux to hiss Roosevelt." Most had the wit to make a calculated bet that they would have to give a little of their wealth, power, and prestige to retain the rest, particularly with the collapsing parliamentary systems of contemporary Europe in mind. Even a bootlegging brigand like Joe Kennedy Sr. reconciled himself to the New Deal. And so it lasted for a generation. The wealthy could get more wealth. Fabulous fortunes were made in World War II. Think of Henry J. Kaiser. But they were subject to a windfall profits tax. And tycoons like Kaiser constructed the Hoover Dam and Liberty ships rather than the synthetic CDOs that precipitated the latest economic collapse. In the 1950s, many Republicans pressed Eisenhower to lower the prevailing 91% top marginal income tax rate, but citing his concerns about the deficit, he refused. In view of our present $15 trillion gross national debt, Ike was right. But as I pointed out earlier in this article, 2007 was probably the last year that anyone even pretended that taxes paid for anything. But if they do begin to feel remorse and want to take some of the money out of the economy, I hope they'll put that 91% top marginal income tax rate back. Characteristic of the era was the widely misquoted and misunderstood statement of General Motors CEO and Secretary of Defense Charles E. Engine Charlie Wilson, who said he believed what was good for the country was good for General Motors, and vice versa. He expressed, however clumsily, the view that the fates of corporations and the citizenry were conjoined. It is a view a world away from the present regime of downsizing, offshoring, profits without production, and financialization. The now prevailing Milton Friedmanite economic dogma holds that a corporation that acts responsibly to the community is irresponsible. Yet somehow in the 1950s, the country eked out higher average GDP growth rates than those we have experienced in the last dozen years. Let's make that the last 25 years. After the 2008 collapse, the worst since the Great Depression, the rich, rather than having the modesty to temper their demands, this time have made the calculated bet that they are politically invulnerable. Wall Street moguls angrily and successfully rejected executive compensation limits even for banks that had been bailed out by taxpayer funds. And what I saw in Congress after the 2008 crash confirms what economist Simon Johnson has said, that Wall Street, and behind it the commanding heights of power that control Wall Street, has seized the policy-making apparatus in Washington. Both parties are enthralled to what our great-grandparents would have called the money power. One party is furtive and hypocritical in its money chase, the other enthusiastically embraces it as the embodiment of the American way. The Citizens United Supreme Court decision of 2 years ago would certainly elicit a response from the 19th century populists similar to their 1892 Omaha platform. It called out the highest court, along with the rest of the political apparatus, as rotted by money. And that high court is still full of rot. Every federal judge is rotten to the core. We meet in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominates the ballot box, the legislatures, the Congress, and touches even the ermine of the bench. The people are demoralized. The newspapers are largely subsidized or muzzled, public opinion silenced, business prostrated, homes covered with mortgages, labor impoverished, and the land concentrating in the hands of capitalists. The urban workmen are denied the right to organize for self-protection. Imported, pauperized labor beats down their wages. The fruits of the toil of millions are boldly stolen to build up colossal fortunes for a few. unprecedented in the history of mankind. And the possessions of these in turn despise the republic and endanger liberty. From the same prolific womb of governmental injustice we breed the two great classes, tramps and millionaires. It is no coincidence that as the Supreme Court has been removing the last constraints on the legalized corruption of politicians, the American standard of living has been falling at the fastest rate in decades. According to the Federal Reserve Board's report of June 2012, the median net worth of families plummeted almost 40% between 2007 and 2010. This is not only a decline when measured against our own past economic performance, it also represents a decline relative to other countries, a far cry from the post-World War II era when the United States had by any measure the highest living standard in the world. A study by the Bertelsmann Foundation concluded that in measures of economic equality, social mobility, and poverty prevention, the United States ranks 27th out of the 31 advanced industrial nations belonging to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Thank God we are still ahead of Turkey, Chile, and Mexico. This raises disturbing questions for those who call themselves conservatives. Almost all conservatives who care to vote congregate in the Republican Party, but Republican ideology celebrates outsourcing, globalization, and takeovers as the glorious fruits of capitalism's creative destruction. As a former Republican congressional staff member, I saw for myself how GOP proponents of globalized vulture capitalism, such as Grover Norquist, Dick Armey, Phil Gramm, and Lawrence Kudlow, extolled the offshoring and financialization process as an unalloyed benefit. They were quick to denounce as socialism any attempt to mitigate its impact on society. Yet their ideology is nothing more than an upside-down utopianism, an absolutist twin of Marxism. If millions of people's interests get damaged in the process of implementing their ideology, it is a necessary outcome of scientific laws of economics that must never be tampered with, just as Lenin believed that his version of materialist laws were final and inexorable. Now this brings up a point that my sister Kelly has mentioned. She feels every time she argues with a progressive, she's always painted as morally unacceptable. And it doesn't bother me because her positions are morally unacceptable, as anyone reading this piece written by a Republican can plainly see. If a morally acceptable American conservatism is ever to extricate itself from a pseudo-scientific, inverted Marxist economic theory, it must grasp that order, tradition, and stability are not coterminous with an uncritical worship of the almighty dollar, nor with obeisance to the demands of the wealthy. Conservatives need to think about the world they want. Do they really desire a social Darwinist dystopia? But you know, those job creators. That was a shout out to my dad. Oh yeah, we got to worship those job creators. I just want to see, Dad, where does Jesus say anything about that? The objective of the predatory super rich and their political handmaidens is to discredit and destroy the traditional nation state and auction its resources to themselves. Those super rich in turn aim to create a toll booth economy whereby more and more of our highways, bridges, libraries, parks, and beaches are possessed by private oligarchs who will extract a toll from the rest of us. Was this the vision of the founders? Was this why they believed governments were instituted among men? That the very sinews of the state should be possessed by the wealthy in the same manner that kingdoms of the old world were the personal property of the monarch? But now we get to the crux of the matter. Since the first ziggurats rose in ancient Babylonia, the so-called forces of order, stability, and tradition have feared a revolt from below. Beginning with Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre after the French Revolution, a whole genre of political writings, some classical liberal, some conservative, some reactionary, has propounded this theme. The title of José Ortega y Gasset's most famous work, The Revolt of the Masses, tells us something about the mental atmosphere of this literature. But in globalized postmodern America, what if this whole vision about where order, stability, and a tolerable framework for governance come from, and who threatens those values, is inverted? What if Christopher Lasch came closer to the truth in The Revolt of the Elites, wherein he wrote, "In our time, the chief threat seems to come from those at the top of the social hierarchy, not the masses." Lasch held that the elites, by which he meant not just the super wealthy, but also their managerial coat holders and professional apologists, were undermining the country's promise as a constitutional republic with their prehensile greed, their asocial cultural values, and their absence of civic responsibility. Lasch wrote that in 1995. Now, almost 2 decades later, 25 years later, the super rich have achieved escape velocity from the gravitational pull of the very society they rule over. They have seceded from America. So reminder, this was written in 2012 by Mike Lofgren, who served 16 years on the Republican staff of the House and Senate Budget Committees. He has just published, in 2012 I assume, "The Party is Over, How Republicans Went Crazy, Democrats Became Useless, and the Middle Class Got Shafted." From what I've read out loud on this show about traditional conservatism, this doesn't surprise me. And I'd welcome comments from traditional conservatives in the comments below. Even though we might have a problem with who should be running things, we're in clear agreement that the people running things now should not be. So the new right-wingers in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party are all of the same mindset. The new right is walking in lockstep in terms of policy, even though they have different kinds of lip service about it. So I'd be interested in checking in with some old school right-wingers and seeing if we can agree on more than just a few things.